This series needs no introduction, and it's too hard, so I'm not going to. Seriously, Zelda is one of Nintendo's biggest franchises, and it's got the same mainline entry count that Mario does. But unlike Mario, every single game is a complete changeover from the last. There's only a few derivative entries, and even then, their mechanics almost always significantly change. But the one thing that's always true is that at the core of every Zelda is the theme of exploration. And of course, that theme stems from where the series began on the NES with The Legend of Zelda, and to a lesser extent, Zelda 2. But here's the thing. We're not actually going to talk about those yet. Don't worry, we will. But there's a point I want to make with these games, and in order to do so, I have to put them at the end of this video. It's going to be worth it, trust me. So, without further ado, let's crack into the Newcomer's Graded Guide to The Legend of Zelda, with the first title, A Link to the Past. If The Legend of Zelda laid the groundwork for the series, A Link to the Past defined its personality and brought Hyrule to life. It made it more than just a game where you wander from dungeon to dungeon and uncover secrets. It made it fun. And the hardware upgrade from the NES to the Super Nintendo gave Nintendo developers a lot more to work with. Because the biggest limitation of the NES was the 2-button controller, Zelda was never really able to do much when it came to your inventory. But the Super Nintendo controller added 4 more buttons, and this upgrade allowed for the use of your most frequently needed items without having to constantly re-equip them. And this significantly reduced the hassle of item management. Or at least it would have had they not added 20 more items to the inventory. In any case, because of the abilities Link now possessed, the world had to change. You couldn't just walk across the entire map from the start because now, there's barriers. And the only way you're crossing these barriers is to continue your quest and collect the gear that lets you open up new paths. And up until Breath of the Wild, this was how every single Zelda game worked. The problem with that is that if you got stuck now, you were screwed. You could just find something else to do and maybe figure it out by pure fluke. You had to solve this puzzle or, well, that was it. And while you never really got lost due to the presence of fortune tellers and a map that basically told you where to go, how you got there and what you did once there wasn't always obvious. Like, you wouldn't know the first time you went to the Lost Woods that there's a warp to the light world, and you'd likely do what I did and spend 20 minutes running around trying to magic mirror your way to the other side. And also, there's one big problem I have with A Link to the Past, and unfortunately, it requires me to criticize the work of another video. And I would be remiss if I didn't at least pay acknowledgement to Ego Raptor's sequelitis. But in his Zelda episode, he makes a point about the Master Sword being an item they talk about in literal terms. But there's a problem. You see, while the Master Sword is undeniably a more powerful sword, its power is almost immediately negated by the way that enemies are scaled up. Forgetting for a second that Dark World enemies are all super strong, all the knights in the Light World get an upgrade, so killing them takes just as long, which renders getting the Master Sword completely underwhelming. And while this is redeemed later by the Tempered Sword, it weakens the strength of your in-game myth when the legendary weapon becomes immediately no better than your original sword. And this is the problem one can have with narrative dictating strength. It undermines the value of both the story and your player's journey when the game scales enemies so that you can't defeat them more easily. And this isn't a problem with Dark World. Dark World enemies being stronger makes sense. It's a world of enemies empowered by Ganon's wish on the Triforce. Logically, they would be able to overpower Link, or at the very least, should be stronger than the enemies in the Light World. And this was just something that Ocarina of Time did so much better. If you encountered a Regen as a child, it'd take you a significant number of hits to defeat just one. But when you encounter them as an adult, which the game forces you to do immediately after obtaining the Master Sword, not only can they not paralyze you anymore, but you can completely overwhelm them with your newfound strength. The value of the Master Sword as the Blade of Evil's Bane is immediately validated, and in doing so, so is the player. But, beyond narrative value, this doesn't take away from A Link to the Past in any way. While it is foolish to give the player a stronger weapon and then immediately invalidate that stronger weapon, the game is built around your relative strength level, so the challenge still feels adequate. In fact, the gameplay is so well polished here that even the simplest combat is super satisfying. And that is the high point of A Link to the Past. It's clear that a lot of care went into designing it. Every corner of this game has something worth seeing, even if it's a small reward like a heart piece or a goofy character. And there's so many little challenges and hidden paths that it's hard not to fall in love with exploring every crevice of this world. It's an experience that stays with you, and will have you thinking about it for a long time. So, should you play it first? Yeah. It's a pretty simple start, and while it can be a bit tough, especially for a new player, or heck, even I have 4 fairies on me at all times, it's still one of the better Zelda experiences, and every 2D Zelda that came after was built on this game's shoulders. Heck, the legacy of this game is so strong that 22 years later, it got a sequel on the 3DS which used many of the same assets and concepts, but changed how you interact with them with one singular gameplay element, and in doing so, kept them feeling fresh. And if there was ever proof of the quality of a game's design, that'd be it. So therefore, A Link to the Past gets a must-play. Now, let's move on to the Game Boy. Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. If there's one thing you'll notice right away about Link's Awakening, it's that it's an amalgamation of all three Zeldas that came before it. Sure, there's the obvious points like it being a top-down adventure, but it also utilized the original Zelda's 2 button mechanics, only this time, you could unequip your sword, which really lent itself well to inventory management. And while on the surface it might seem like just a simplified version of A Link to the Past, in actuality, it introduced a mechanic that A Link to the Past desperately needed. And that mechanic is jumping. You see, A Link to the Past introduced enemies that could attack from overhead. And this gave A Link to the Past, as Eagle Raptor again pointed out, a selective Z-axis where enemies could hit you, but you couldn't necessarily hit them. But a bunch of enemies in this game, like the Stalfos, are completely obnoxious to try to hit from the ground level, and it becomes a big point of frustration when you're stuck on the ground, impotently swinging at nothing. But thankfully, Link's Awakening fixed that by adding the Roc's Feather, an item you get in the first dungeon, which lets you jump over open pits, jump during platforming segments, but most importantly, allowed you to attack airborne enemies and literally remedied this Stalfos situation. And this reflects an entire series of design choices made by the team that made Link's Awakening. The most useful items you get, and the ones that'll have the most impact on how you'll play the game, are given to you in descending order in each dungeon. Like, you never use the magic rod you got from level 8, but the power bracelet from level 2? You use that all the time. Same goes for the flippers versus, like, the mirror shield, which has about 2 practical uses. Though, unlike previous Zeldas, you can actually use the shield in Link's Awakening, so it doesn't feel like such a useless cosmetic upgrade like it had thus far. And this isn't to say that those latter items aren't cool and don't serve any purpose, but they don't really enable you to further explore Koholint or affect how you interact with the world like the Roc's Feather and the Power Bracelet. And this is why Link's Awakening, in my opinion, is a master class in how to design a 2D Zelda game. Instead of barring us with a character that says, "Hey, you can't go this way," the game sets up a physical reason why you can't yet go this way. But by defeating the dungeon and increasing your arsenal of weapons and skills, you'll eventually be able to overcome this barrier and move forward. And speaking of dungeons, Link's Awakening has the best upgrade for a Zelda staple item, the compass, which now makes an audible chime when there's a key in a room that isn't necessarily in a chest, which is so useful. Now look, you might think this would reveal too much information about the dungeon and make the game too easy, but it doesn't. Because while it may now be obvious there's a key in a room, what isn't always obvious is how you get to it. Like this one where the key falls into an open pit. Well shit, now what do I do? But if you happen to go down this staircase here, you'll find the key has actually fallen into another room entirely, and it's waiting for you to come and pick it up. Hush, child. Call me daddy. Sorry, started projecting there. Now, Link's Awakening isn't without flaw, but the flaws are more the limitations of the hardware rather than the game itself. You see, back when we only had 2 buttons to do everything, it made sense to make them swappable since you had this big inventory and only so much could be used at once. But that led to a lot of pausing the action and performing inventory management. And it's one of those things that could just be remedied by a modern remake. Like, look. Now that we have way more buttons, and in the case of the 3DS and the Switch, a touchscreen, we have a lot more room to maneuver, and it'd be pretty simple to do a mock-up like this and significantly reduce how often a player needs to go into the pause menu. Heck, some of the equipment doesn't even need to be an item anymore. Like, there's no reason for the Power Bracelet to be an item, just has to be equipment that he wears, like the Goron Bracelet. Okay, but back to the actual game. Link's Awakening is surprisingly well balanced in terms of difficulty. Like, there's this guy called Orira, and if you need to, you can call him and get a hint about what you're supposed to do next, because sometimes it's just not obvious. And while you can always get a hint from Orira, and it'll be pretty specific, there is often an obstacle in the way that won't be. Like here, Orira tells you to go to the desert, and you go to the desert and there's a big walrus in the way. Alright. Clearly, he wants Marin. So you go talk to Marin, but Marin just does her usual thing. Huh, well that's weird. I guess maybe there's something else I have to do before Marin will come with me? And that's what you have to figure out. In this case, it was doing a side quest called the Trading Sequence, where you trade item for item until finally, this bear tells you how to wake up the walrus. Now, I do think it is kind of stupid that the game forces this side quest on you without really indicating it has anything to do with waking up the walrus, or, as far as I'm aware, even informs you that this side quest exists. But if you're exploring the game and just having fun with it like a lot of players will, you probably already stumbled on it anyway. But still, that is a significant misstep. Regardless, the game doesn't totally hold your hand. You don't have to go for a hint, and there's no one spewing, "Go this path," on you every 5 minutes. So the difficulty curve and challenge of exploration is still maintained. Really up to this point, Link's Awakening was the most original yet simultaneously the most Zelda-y Zelda that Nintendo ever released. And beyond a few small factors like repetitive slow text transitions and overabundant item switching, it's aged really, really well. Plus, returning the series to its roots with single screen transitions allowed for a tile-based map that charted which areas you've explored and which areas you hadn't, which allowed you to go back and look for secrets when you finally had the necessary gear. Really, it's just that level of polish and planning you've come to expect from Zelda. But that question again, should you play it first? Absolutely yes! In terms of difficulty, in terms of exploration, in terms of gameplay, in terms of, well, everything, Link's Awakening kills it. Honestly, as an introduction to Zelda, Link's Awakening's biggest shortcoming might be that it raises the bar too high and makes other Zeldas pale in comparison. You get everything you expect from a Zelda game and a new take on how a Zelda game should be. Heck, the game was literally used as the basis for both Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, and those came out almost 8 years later. So to not upgrade the game in any significant fashion and still have it serve as the blueprint for not one, but 2 brand new Zelda games says a lot about the quality of the design. It may be a bit rough at times, but overall, Link's Awakening is as definitive a Zelda as the series gets. And therefore, Link's Awakening gets a must-play. Told you scores would be high. Just wait until this next one. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And so, we're here, at the game that changed Zelda for generations. Seriously, for about 20 years, this was Zelda. Every subsequent Zelda game tried to live up to this, and every fan wanted more. And they got it. Again, and again, and again, and honestly a couple more times. This game achieved a legacy rarely seen in games, and its following could have its own freaking religion by now. This was a style of game truly unseen, and to my knowledge, basically invented the targeting system that many third-person games use today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time praising this game. That's boring. And I also don't know how. I just like it. Instead, I'm going to attempt to tear apart my own memories and give you a fair and balanced look at this game. But before I go into my criticism of this game, I want you guys to know that I love Ocarina of Time, and it is impossible for me to look at it without nostalgia goggles on. So, with the intention of being fair to newcomers, I sat down with a friend and had him play it without any guidance from me at all, and here's what I found. Number 1, text moves slow. Honestly, this for me is the biggest flaw to Ocarina of Time, and it's an absolute immersion killer. And you'll always hear some people say, well, I don't encounter that because I don't talk to pointless NPCs. Well, yeah, sure, when you guys play Ocarina now, you know exactly what to do. So you don't encounter all the pointless NPCs or confusion that might slow you down. Hell, I bet not one of you calls Navi anymore. And you should. She misses you. But that's because you grew up in an era where all of this was brand new and hadn't been done better. You didn't have anything to compare it to, so in your mind, this was the best. But for someone today, that doesn't hold up. And it's easy to love a game where you know exactly what you're doing and you never get anything wrong. Like, you'd never talk to this stupid guy on a regular playthrough. He doesn't offer any plot significance. And that's the problem with nostalgia. We don't remember everything that was wrong that we got used to, or the bad decisions that we didn't have anything to compare to. We just have the fond memories and the good feelings associated with them. Imagine I told you today that there's this game. It came out for the Switch, it's pretty cool, it's got puzzles and monsters and whatever, but every so often a big owl comes along and talks your ear off, the text moves super slowly, and there's this annoying fairy that interrupts you from beginning to end. Bit of a hard sell, isn't it? I mean, obviously I'm not focusing on the game's numerous positives, but a new player is going to notice these things because for the first 2 hours of the game, that's what you experience. It gets better. It absolutely does get better. And like any game, when you're finally out of the tutorial stages, it stops holding your hand so much. You know, it's not Pokemon Sun and Moon. But when your impression of the game is this consistent up until you become an adult, it's really hard to make an argument against these flaws. Speaking of which, number 2, Hyrule Field is empty. Originally, I was pissed when my friend made this point, not because I think it's wrong, but because it absolutely undermines every argument I ever made against Wind Waker's Ocean and Twilight Princess's Field, which, for those of you who don't know, are wide open and empty, and they feel like it. I always felt that maybe this was just a problem of scale with those games, but once this was pointed out, I couldn't unsee it. There is literally nothing in Hyrule Field, and it really only serves as a big gap between places. Hell, there's only enemies wandering around at night, and let's be honest, Style Childs can barely be considered enemies. Now, it's not necessarily a problem that Hyrule Field is empty, but a new player is going to spend a lot more time here than a veteran is, and doing nothing for that time doesn't leave a good impression. Now, it's not a big map, so you're not really going to get lost. But when you're inexperienced, it is kind of problematic that you have this big field, which up until this game had been chock full of secrets, enemies, and characters, and have nothing to really do in it. In fact, the only major things you do here are kill a few Skulltulas and ride Epona for the big Poe quest. Really, it just drags Ocarina down in my mind just a little bit. Now, with all that being said, and for the consideration of grading, The remake and most readily available version of this game fixes almost all of these issues and is in effect the saving grace of Ocarina of Time. All the text is much faster, the visuals are all improved upon significantly, certain gear is switched to items allowing for quick switching, and despite it still being the same game, it's less excruciating for a new player to get stuck. Even though Navi and other interruptions still occur at the same frequency, the fast text movement makes them significantly less intrusive, and it really makes Ocarina of Time a much more enjoyable experience. So, that question, should you play it first? Yes, but only if you're playing the 3DS version. I'll say it again, I love Ocarina of Time. I really, really do. But the original game is no longer a good way to introduce a newcomer to Zelda. But the 3DS game improves so significantly upon all the shortcomings of the original that it becomes so much more accessible and so much more user-friendly as a result. It's not that the original game was bad, not at all. There's a reason that every single Zelda afterwards tried to be Ocarina of Time, and it's because for most people, it was that great. And for some new players, it still will be that great. I mean, if you're a young kid or you just don't read that fast, you're not really gonna notice some slow text crawls here and there. And even still, now you don't have to. It's a game that defined an entire era of gaming and even inspired several after. And it is impossible to deny it the respect that it deserves. It's not perfect, but even at its worst, it pioneered a new level of immersion, and it's one of the best games Nintendo ever made. And since this is the first time a remake of this significance has come up, we're going to have to score things a tad differently, because while they are identical games, the difference in aging is quite significant. So, Ocarina of Time gets a yes, and Ocarina of Time 3D gets a must play. Also of note, Ocarina of Time was the first game to get an actual direct sequel. Speaking of which, The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. So, you're probably thinking that if I had to get a second person to play Ocarina of Time, that I probably had to get one to play Majora's Mask too. But I didn't. Short answer being it wasn't necessary, and long answer being I don't have that much time to sit on my ass and watch someone else play video games. But the truth is, Majora's Mask actually significantly improved upon a lot of the objective issues that made Ocarina of Time hard to get through. The text doesn't completely crawl, Tattle is significantly less intrusive than Navi, Terminative Field is full of secrets and life, and the owl appears like once. Really, it just hit a lot of the beats that Ocarina missed. Now, it definitely made its own mistakes, but unlike Ocarina, they're less gameplay problems, but limitations of the game's central mechanic, the living world. You see, Majora's Mask was built around this concept of one constantly living world that's going on as you play the game. There is a meter at the bottom of the screen that's measuring time passing, and as it passes, characters in the game are following their daily routines. And that includes what these characters do, where they go, and sometimes even what rewards you'll get from their quests. But Link's actions within this world could also alter the trajectory of these characters' lives, for better or for worse. And rather than being just a sequel to Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask shifted its focus from the grand adventure where you journey across the land to a smaller adventure where you interact with all the characters within it. And in the process of doing this, managed to create a cause and effect relationship with the player. For example, normally, during the course of the Cafe and Anju quest, you could go into this door and get the Keaton mask. But I fucked up here because I stopped Sakan on night 1. So now he doesn't come back to the curiosity shop trying to sell the bomb bags he stole. Cafe doesn't see that and chase him to Ikana Canyon. So he doesn't give the mask and the letter to the curiosity shop owner, and I can't get that from him or use them to go get the postman's hat. Instead, I just stand here. But anyway, Majora's Mask created characters that didn't just serve as plot devices, but people with real wants and depth. And this was new for a Zelda game. While Ocarina of Time gave you some degree of characterization with characters like Saria and Saria, there really wasn't much beyond what was on the surface. Even Navi, who's with you for the whole game, doesn't really have a personality. But Tattle? She's got a story, she's got depth, and her history and relationship with the Skull Kid is interesting. I won't pretend it's the most enthralling storyline ever written, but it makes Tattle a part of the adventure rather than just an obnoxious guide. And this is what separates Majora's Mask from Ocarina of Time. The world is just so connected and every action you take has consequence. There is weight to your decisions, even if they are technically reversible. And the whole game is stylized to have this cinematic feel with dark shadows and haunting imagery that reminds you of death, which is one of the game's biggest recurring themes. Hell, you're running around as dead people for 3/4 of the game who are about to be cataclysmically crushed by a giant, angry moon. So it'd be kind of hard for Nintendo to be all sunshine and rainbows this time. Heck, even before all that, the game opens on Link, traveling alone, searching for his friend who left him. So we open on a downer note and set the tone of this game right away. And on that note, we should probably talk about the gameplay, because for the majority of this game, you aren't even playing as Link. You see, the game centers around the collection of these masks, which grant Link different abilities. And these masks all have varying degrees of power, whether it be a radar system, speed, no clue, and the ability to listen to Anju's grandma. But the most important masks are a set of 3 transformation masks which give Link brand new forms as a Deku Scrub, a Goron, and a Zora. And these completely change the way Link can interact with the world, because each transformation gives Link an advantage on different terrain. Now, there is one shortcoming with this system, and it's the same one that's always a problem with Zelda, and that's inventory management. Because you're likely to always have a mask set to your C buttons, 2 if you're fairy hunting, you're going to be inventory swapping a lot. And while it doesn't drag the game to a halt, it does slow things down just a little bit. Now, is there room for improvement? Yeah. It's called Majora's Mask 3D. Fact is, while I could name off a few more problems with the original game, they are all remedied by the most readily available version of this game. Much like Ocarina of Time 3D, the text now moves like lightning, the menus are all handled by the touchscreen, and inventory management is now much less problematic. Honestly, these portable games just nail the immersion factor. But, once again, should you play it first? Yeah! Out of all the games I've shown you so far, this one has the best learning curve, the least frustrating mechanics, and the strongest story, even if it isn't necessarily in the game's main narrative. Majora's Mask is a remarkable achievement in the Zelda franchise, and it's a game that while I can look at objectively, I can't be about my feelings for it. This was the first game that I ever bonded with friends over, and as sad as that might be, it was briefly a cornerstone of my social life. Majora's Mask is an experience that hasn't been repeated since. No Zelda, even today, has managed to do so well with characterization and create a world that really felt alive. While the narratives in Zelda did get stronger, when it comes to the strengths of theme, tone, and character, Majora's Mask is unrivaled. And therefore, Majora's Mask and Majora's Mask 3D both get a must-play. Now, let's finally go back and take a look at the games where it all began. The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Okay, so we're finally back to these two. There's a reason I saved these games for last, and I think it's become more apparent as we've gone through. While I don't deny these games are fun and good for their time, nowadays there is something lost to them without the context the rest of the franchise gives them. I'm sure plenty of people played these games first and absolutely loved them, and I'm sure that will always be true. But to talk about these games with any reverence, for me at least, requires the context of the other games in the series, simply because that's how I played them. And there is also one more reason, and it's a lot sadder and nerdier, and I fucking love it. You see, back when I played these, around 2005, I was an avid member of an online Zelda community, and one of the biggest points of discussion at the time was the Zelda timeline, which, as you may or may not know, was totally shrouded in secrecy until the release of Hyrule Historia. And despite that being the official timeline, to some, including myself, it is still not accurate and filled with holes. But I'll get into that another time. But despite those errors, it was generally agreed upon that the original Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link took place at the end of that timeline. So all the events of the newest Zeldas were all leading up to this point where the series began. And now, in order for me to get the true ending of the series, I had to overcome some of the most challenging and admittedly dated design concepts. So for me, the context wasn't that I was playing old games that didn't shine quite as well as they used to, but rather that these old games were an obstacle I had to overcome in order to experience the overarching story. And given how hard these games are the first time around, it is next to impossible to recommend them to a newcomer. You don't play these games anymore to experience what Zelda is. You play them because you're so diehard in love with the series that you have to play every single one. So much so that you played 4 Swords and Triforce Heroes by yourself. But okay, some analysis. Zelda 1 was a groundbreaking adventure, and it really set the framework for the rest of the series, even all the way up to Breath of the Wild. And while the game wasn't anything special to look at, the concept of secret paths, cryptic hints, and hunting monsters were all still here. Imagine if you tore down all the fancy bells and whistles of A Link to the Past and made a game that was only that exploration. You'd have the original Zelda. And while it is fun in a certain light, it's definitely not a game you'd want to experience to get into a series, because it's a massive world, and what you're supposed to do in it is quite often not obvious whatsoever. Heck, it's entirely possible for you to leave without taking your sword, so it's possible to hinder yourself right from the get-go. But if you have the patience to sit through some challenging obstacles and learn just how the game's mechanics work, you can adapt and quickly find that there's a lot to see in this world. But follow a map for the heart containers, because those are just stupid. Zelda 2, on the other hand, changed things, and it became a game completely unlike its predecessor or any other Zelda that came after. Instead of an adventure game, we had a platforming RPG with towns and NPCs, experience points, and enemies you fight on a 2D side-scrolling plane. And to be honest, I kinda love it. While it isn't the most Zelda-y Zelda, when you know the tricks to the experience system, it's actually super fun to min-max Link and just demolish the game. But that's just me. For a newcomer, this game is horrible. First off, beyond having Link, this game is almost nothing like what we've come to know as a Zelda. There's no puzzles, there's very few treasures, and you're not collecting an arsenal of weapons and items you can use to explore and take down enemies. You're just dungeon crawling and fighting enemy encounters. And the sheer volume of enemies a new player will have to grind through to be strong enough is just disgusting. It's a pretty awful game for a newcomer and honestly does no favors to the series as a whole. In fact, it's almost effectively ignored. And like the original, it's pretty much only doing this one thing from start to finish with no real curveballs thrown in, so there's not really all that much to say about it. So, to sum it up, both games are really going to be difficult to recommend, and it's going to be seriously dependent on you as a person. If your gaming sensibilities don't stop you from enjoying some somewhat dated mechanics and visuals, then you'll probably find something to love here. And they aren't long games, so you won't be sinking a lot of time in. But if you're looking to get into the series, it's best to look elsewhere. But I cannot overstate the value that these two games have, because despite them aging as many NES games have, they defined what Zelda was, and their influence on Breath of the Wild is immediately noticeable. You see it in the vast open world with little sense of direction, in the return of the platforming mechanics that are now a central mechanic, and in the focus on enemy encounters in each and every area. These games are remembered because they are worth remembering. And even if they're not for you, they're the reason action-adventure games are at the point they're at. The influence of the Zelda series on gaming as a whole is undeniable, and I personally cannot wait to dig into the rest of the series for part 2, because it only gets bigger from here. So, The Legend of Zelda gets a yes, and Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, gets a skip it. And that's it for now. Come back soon for part 2, where we're going to talk about the most controversial Zelda in this series, the Wind Waker, and I'm going to attempt to capture multiplayer footage from Four Swords Adventures, so we'll see how the heck that goes. Either way, it's going to be a fun one, so look out for that coming soon. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I am constantly looking for ways to improve this series, so if you have any feedback, please let me know. And if you didn't see it before, I did a video like this for the Super Mario series, so check that out if that's your thing. And if you'd like to help me out, please share the video. And as always, thank you for watching.